Okay, hey, welcome. We're going to do chapter 7. We're going to talk about some religious wars. We talked about some exploration and we talked about some reformation, and now we're going to get down to some religious wars that are going to spill out in Europe. And you're like, well, what are all these wars about? Well, here's what's going to happen. You have this Reformation that comes about because of Martin Luther and the development of the Protestant church and the excuse me, I'm sorry, late in the day, and the loss of power of the Catholic Church. And so the Catholic Church is going to want to recapture some of the lands and some of the power that they've lost over time. And so for about a 200-year period, Europe's just in a constant state of war. And really, throughout much of its history, Europe is in a constant state of war. And then the Habsburg family, which is in control of Spain, and they also control the Holy Roman Empire, they're going to be at war for 2/3 of that time. So you're dealing with 130 years of war in a 200-year period for the Habsburgs, and it's going to be very, very costly. And ultimately, it's going to be one of the reasons that's going to lead to this change of power in Europe. So here we go. You look at this map here of Europe, and you can see the Habsburg domination roughly in the year 1700. They control all of Spain down here in the red. They control most of the yellow. They control the yellow over here: Austria, Hungary, Bohemia. They are pretty much in control of areas that are striped, but they share some power with local princes, the yellow stripes, and then they control modern day Netherlands up in here. Places in Spain, Italy, Naples. Basically everything that's not in gray is either influenced heavily or controlled by the Habsburgs. And so they're going to be the dominant force, and they're Catholics, and they're going to control a lot of Europe. And ultimately, that's what we're looking at, I suppose. So keep that in mind. We're going to start our story in France and look at some of the religious turmoil in France, and then we'll come back to the Habsburgs. But France is mostly Catholic. Even today, Catholicism is very heavy in France, and probably 90-10 split back in the day. And the French Protestants are called Huguenots. And typically they're pretty well to do. They're upper to middle class, upper to upper middle class, and while France is a Catholic country, they kind of play the role of little brother to Spain. And so anywhere that the Protestants can weaken the hold of Catholicism is going to weaken the Habsburgs' control and the Spanish control on all of Europe. And if you remember back to our first lecture, Spain has tons and tons of money coming into their treasury because of the New World and the discoveries of the New World and their gold mines and silver mines and whatnot. And so anything that can weaken the Spanish is going to help the French. And so the French starts to have a lot of fighting between their Huguenot population and their Catholic population. And Charles X, he's King of France. He's not necessarily over religious. He's Catholic, but he doesn't really care one way or the other. And he has a sister by the name of Margaret. She's over there on the right. There's Charles X on the left, and Charles X comes up with this pretty brilliant idea. He's going to get Henry, I think it's Henry of what's the name? Navarre. Henry of Navarre, who's a Huguenot prince. He's a Protestant prince, and he's going to marry him off to his sister Margaret. And so we're going to take the Protestants and the Catholics, and we're going to marry them together. And so Henry shows up to Paris with a couple thousand of his closest friends, and they're unarmed because they're going to a wedding. There's Henry and Margaret, and they get married, and And Henry converts to Catholicism. And then 5 short days later, King Charles X is going to kill off all of Henry's friends in a massacre. It's called the Saint Bartholomew's Day Massacre in France. And he's going to throw Henry into prison. And so it was believed that this would weaken the Protestant hold, I suppose, or whatever. And it probably does. And it creates actually more problems in France than anything. And so the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre spills out, and Huguenots are killed throughout Paris. And here's a painting of the massacre of the King's men killing off Prince Henry's entourage, I suppose. And so ultimately, Henry of Navarre escapes from Paris, and he forms his own army. And that's going to lead to a war because Charles X is going to die. And King Henry III, who is Charles X's brother and brother to Princess Margaret, forms an army, and so he's the Catholic King of France. You have Prince Henry the Fourth of Navarre, which he's a Huguenot leader, and he's Margaret's husband, the one that married Margaret and then was imprisoned. And then you have Henry the Duke of Guise, who's the leader of the Catholic League, like the top Catholic in France. And he was Margaret's former lover, and so Margaret's kind of torn, right? And so ultimately, King Henry and Henry of Guise are both assassinated, and Henry, Prince of Navarre, wins out. And so Henry the Fourth is crowned King of France, and then he converts to Catholicism. This time, for real, like he agrees to become Catholic, and he famously says that Paris is worth attending the mass. And he was yeah, I don't know. He annuls his marriage with Margaret, and I believe he kills her, gets rid of her. And he issues this Edict of Nantes, which spells out that, hey, you know what, we're going to have religious tolerance in France. Basically, the Huguenots can form their own society outside of France, inside the French country, but outside of the political mainstream. They can live in their own cities, and they can wall them up. They can have small governments and armies, but they have to stay out of Paris, which is kind of a weird situation. They need to stay out of Paris. And so Henry IV, he's very popular. And even after he dies, this dual state solution kind of keeps peace in France for a pretty good period of time. Okay, so let's go back to the Habsburgs, I guess. We looked at that map, and maybe we should move that slide. That would probably make more sense. But the Habsburg dynasty, it's probably the most powerful in Europe. Obviously, it is. It controls a huge chunk of Europe. And Charles V finds himself the head of this family. And not only is he the king of Spain, but he's also the Holy Roman Emperor. And that's just too much work for him. And he's like, hey, forget this. This is too much work for one person. And he decides he's going to split the kingdom before he dies. And he gives the Holy Roman Empire to his brother, Ferdinand. And he gives the rule of Spain to his son, Philip II. And so there you go. There's Philip II, I believe, on the left, and Ferdinand on the right. And we look at this land that he's going to control. You know, at one point, this is Charles II. He's going to control all of Spain. You know, he's going to control large portions of the Holy Roman Empire here down into Naples. He's going to control large chunks of the New World. And so he's going to have a lot on his plate, and it's just too much. He divides that up. He gives modern day Germany, let's just say modern day Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, to his brother Ferdinand, and he gives Spain and the New World to his son Philip II. Philip II is kind of interesting because Philip II sees himself as like this protector of Catholicism. And so he comes about shortly after the Reformation, and he wants to restore Catholicism to the way it was before Martin Luther. And so he believes that, hey, you know what, we just need to convert people like the Muslims and the Jews that are living in Spain. to our side, and they just need a little bit of encouragement. And so he starts the Spanish Inquisition, which goes out and they like capture people and torture them and try to force them to convert to Catholicism, and they're relatively unsuccessful there. Tortures people and all those things. So really, if you wanted to try to change people's minds about religion and move them to your side, probably imprisoning them and capturing them and torturing them is probably not the way to go about it. Interestingly enough, Philip II marries Mary Tudor from England, and we talked about the English Reformation a little bit, and King Henry, Henry VIII. Mary was Henry VIII's firstborn child, his oldest daughter, and they tried to reinstate Catholicism to England. And they, again, they persecute people and they kill them, and they're co-monarchs of England. And upon Mary's death, Philip II tries to marry her sister Elizabeth, and she rejects his advances. Mary and Philip were only married for a short period of time, 4 years. When Elizabeth rejects Philip II, England kind of becomes I don't know, on his target list. Like he's going to conquer England, and he's going to become King of England again. And so that's really kind of his goal. And this is just kind of foreshadowing what we're going to talk about with the Habsburg family here when we get into absolutism. But you can look at the family tree here of the Habsburgs, and here's Philip II down here, and there's his wife Mary. But if you're, I don't know if you quite remember this, but Henry VIII, his first wife, is Catherine of Aragon, and Catherine of Aragon is daughters of Ferdinand of Aragon, who was the King of Spain, who funded Columbus's trip to the New World. And so that would make, I believe this situation right here would make Philip II and Mary the First of England first cousins, which is, you see the Habsburgs marrying within the family and keeping things really, really close. And ultimately, that's going to be one of the downfalls of the Habsburg family, is this this interbreeding, or this inability or reluctance to marry outside of the family in order to try to consolidate power. Okay, and so while Philip is relatively successful in keeping the Spanish in Spain practicing Catholicism, he's unable to reconquer Catholicism into England. He's unable to maintain a lot of the Catholic faith in territories further away from Spain. So the Netherlands, for instance, if we go back to, we go back here, here's land that was controlled by Charles V and then later Philip II, and here's the Netherlands. They're in control there, but you get the whole country of France in between Spain and the Netherlands, and it's hard to control. It's hard to control those people, and so the Netherlands is a relatively wealthy area. They have they have a booming economy based on trade. They're relatively religiously tolerant. They allow Muslims to practice. They allow Protestants and Catholics and all of those things to happen. And so Philip II wants to force Catholicism back into the Netherlands and make basically everybody Catholic again. And the Dutch Revolt, and we call this the Dutch Revolt of that era. And the Calvinists, they start to attack Catholic churches around 1566, and other Protestant groups begin to rebel. And Philip sends Spanish troops in, and the Inquisition, and then the Dutch, as more pressure builds up on the Dutch to convert, they dig in and they refuse to do that. And they start to unify. And so this rebellion turns into not a religious rebellion, but a war of independence. The Dutch are trying to break free the Spanish. And if that would happen, well, then that would start to diminish the power of Spain and the ability of the Spanish to control large chunks of the continent of Europe. And so the French and the British start to get involved, and the British, the English specifically, they start to send money to the Netherlands, kind of on the low key. They don't want maybe they don't want Spain to know, but they start to send money and goods and people. And the Spanish are spending a ridiculous amount of money trying to fight and keep these people as part of their territory. And we get back into what we talked about before, like with Henry VIII and the change of England from Catholic and then Anglican to Protestant to Catholic to back to Anglican. And so Elizabeth, who is Mary's half sister, and she rejects Philip's romantic gestures to Mary, is in control of there's Mary and there's Elizabeth. And so Elizabeth is going to be in charge, and she's going to support the Dutch, and Philip is going to see this as a huge slap in the face. And then on top of that, Mary is going to support this group of Englishmen, and they're going to be called privateers. And basically, they're just sailors that rob, or they're pirates, more or less. They're pirates, they're bandits that rob treasure ships of the Spanish. And they indirectly work for the British, indirectly work for England. And Sir Francis Drake is probably the most famous of these pirateers or pirates, and he goes out and he robs Spanish treasure ships, and he makes a ton of money for England. And Elizabeth knights Sir Francis Drake, and there's rumors that they're lovers, and it infuriates Philip II. And so she rejects Philip's affections. She funds his enemies. She has privateers attack his treasure ships, and Philip just can't take it anymore. And he decides that he's going to invade England, and he's going to dethrone Elizabeth, and he's going to restore Catholicism to England. And so he builds a huge invasion fleet of 132 ships and thousands of soldiers, and they're going to sail in what's known as the Spanish Armada, and they're going to sail up the coast of Spain, hug the coast of France, and the plan is to cross over the English Channel and invade England. The problem is the British don't have treasure fleets like the Spanish do. The Spanish have these big clunky ships that are made to carry huge sums of cargo. Well, the British ships are fast, and they're kind of, they're not. If you think of this, think of it like almost like semi-trailers. Like the Spanish are driving semi-trailers, and the British, they're going to rob those semi-trailers in sports cars, and they're going to steal a bunch of stuff, and then they're going to drive off or something along those lines, right? And so the British have ships that are much faster. They have better cannons that can shoot further, because those are the needs of the British Navy or the British privateers versus the Spanish. And so the British start to attack the Spanish fleet in the open sea, and they shoot them with their cannons, and then they kind of sail away. And they really don't face any losses, and they're commanded by Sir Francis Drake. And the Spanish fleet is kind of banged up a little bit by the British attacks. They kind of hit and run and whatever. And they decide they're going to anchor, and they're going to rest off the coast of France. And so they pull into a French harbor. And they're supposed to pick up some Spanish troops that were marching down from the Netherlands to transport them across. The fleet is going to transport them across the Channel into England. But before that happens, the English are going to launch an attack on the Spanish fleet. And so they use this tactic of filling their boats full of gunpowder and then lighting the boats on fire, and they'll sail them into the harbor, and hopefully they hit a Spanish boat and the gunpowder explodes, and they can catch the Spanish boat on fire, or they can just cause chaos. And then the British boat, the English boats are going to sit out in the harbor, and they're out in the channel, and they're going to wait for the Spanish to run out, and they're going to try to sink them. And they're just trying to create they're trying to create mass chaos, and that's absolutely 100% what they do. They light boats on fire, and they sink some Spanish boats, and some of the Spanish boats come out of the harbor, and they get sunk by British privateers, and the Spanish kind of they regroup and they reform, and they decide they don't have the forces to invade England left, and they sail around England, around the Northern Sea. And this whole time they're getting harassed by the English privateers and the English fleet, and they sail into storms in the Northern Sea, and they get caught up there, and they lose almost half of the 132 ships to the fire attacks, and then to the storms. And so then they return back to Spain, and they're horribly defeated. And this British victory over the Spanish Armada by the British privateers and the small British Navy allows basically allows England to continue to exist. It's no longer going to be threatened by the Spanish military power, and it's the beginning of the end for the power of Spain over Europe. They're defeated by England, which at that time is a relatively small, weak island, and here Spain is like the largest force in the entire world. And England begins to focus its energies on colonies overseas, and then they're not going to focus their energies on religion, while the Spanish are going to continue to try to force Catholicism on other people in other areas that they don't want. And so while that's going on, the Spanish are going to spend tons of money trying to force people into a religion that they don't want. And the British are going to encourage people to move to the New World and establish farms and tax bases and those types of things. And the British are going to grow. And British Empire and power is going to grow, and the Spanish Empire and power is going to shrink. So from 1618 to 1648, that's the 30-year period, we have what's known as the 30 Years' War. And if we were in European history, we could spend, probably an entire class period or an entire semester on this conflict. But what we really need to know is that a ton of people die, close to 8 million people die, which is 20 to 40% of the German population. Most of the 30 Years' War is going to be fought in the Holy Roman Empire or in modern day Germany. So you can kind of see a map there and some of the battles that are going to take place. And so basically it starts as a conflict between the Holy Roman Empire and the Protestant princes of northern Germany. And the Holy Roman Empire is trying to reinstall trying to force the conversion of Catholicism to all areas of the Holy Roman Empire. Not only were they used to influence heavily areas, but Protestantism has taken over. And so all of a sudden the Holy Roman Empire decides, hey, we're going to force Catholicism on all these Protestants, and the Protestants kind of reject it. It starts in Bohemia. There's some officials that get thrown out of a window, and then the Holy Roman Emperor decides to respond. And so like the Bohemians, they put their support behind Protestant princes of northern Germany, and it just leads to conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics in the Holy Roman Empire. And for the first, 10 years or so, the Catholics are going to win huge chunks of land. They're going to take over Bohemia. They're going to do that. And Ferdinand II decides that he's kind of feeling his oats, like he's got this thing sewed up, and he's going to demand that all the lands that were seized from the Catholic Church be returned back to the Catholic Church. But it's been 20 years since or 80 years since the Reformation, and that's 1 or 2 lifetimes during this time frame. And so it's not a very popular idea. I've owned this land the entire time, and now the church wants it back, and so that becomes problematic. And then in 1630, Sweden, who had converted to Protestantism, joins the war on the side of the Protestants and the Protestant princes. And the support of Sweden starts to turn the tide against the Habsburgs and the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholics. And then France begins to fund the Swedish army, which is interesting because France is a Catholic country. But if you remember, France and Spain are competing with each other for influence. And so anytime that you have an enemy of your enemy, that person becomes your friend. So the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so the enemy of Spain is Sweden. And so the French begin to give money to Sweden. And it changes this balance of power, and they regain a bunch of lands. And about 5 years after the Swedes enter the war, the French enter the war on the side of the Protestants, and it's no longer about religion, it's just about power. And the French and the Holy Roman Empire fight until 1648. And when a truce is called, there's 8 million people dead, and there's 50 years worth of economical hardship ahead of everybody. And really, it's kind of a draw. There's not the Catholics gain some ground, but they lose population, and so that's a win. I guess that's a win for the Catholics that they get a larger percentage of land than they had before the start of the war. But they don't achieve all of their military victory or objectives of reconquering the Holy Roman Empire, returning everybody within the Holy Roman Empire over to Protestants. And so a lot of the Protestant areas remain, and the Holy Roman Empire remains Catholic, and that's where we are. The winners that are going to come out of this war are going to be France and Sweden, because they're going to increase their power on the European stage. Austria becomes one of the more powerful individual German states that's part of the Holy Roman Empire. So Austria becomes a large regional player, if not a world player at that point. And Spain is going to be the loser. Spain is going to flip the bill. The Habsburgs are going to pay for this. And although all that money is coming into Spain from their colonies of the New World, they're going to spend more money than they have, and it's going to bankrupt the Spanish treasury, and they're going to lose focus on economic expansion into Western Europe, and they're going to not focus on Atlantic trade as much as they probably should, and they're going to lose footholds in places like North America. And it's going to allow Britain to go in and set up colonies and farms and increase their population there. And so the Spanish are going to suffer. And this new Atlantic trade is going to bring about a new middle class in places like Britain or the Netherlands or even France to a lesser extent, and which the Spanish aren't going to have. And so, the backbone of an economy is going to be that middle class. It's going to buy new items, or buy, machine-made items once we get into the period of industrialization that's going to follow colonization. The Spanish are going to lag behind. Things that the 30 Years' War is going to bring about a change in Europe is the first one is that it's going to be the last of the religious wars. It's going to be the last of the times where Catholics are going to fight Protestants. There's 200-year period in which religion is going to be the main focus of conflict in Europe. But it's too costly. And after 8 million people, after the 30 Years' War, 8 million people are going to die. And it's going to do very little to change the way people view religion in Europe. And so there's other reasons to fight, and we're gonna find all kinds of those reasons throughout the rest of this class. It's also going to lead to the development of professional armies. During the 30 Years' War, you're still dealing with feudalism, in which kings and princes are going to look to the common people as ways of forming armies. After the 30 Years' War, it's too expensive to ask common people to line up and fight. And so you start to see the development of professional armies where you pay soldiers to come and fight. And that's where we are. So nations become beholden in some ways to professional armies of professional soldiers that are paid to fight, instead of common people that are under the rule of nobility. And so that gets us to the end. That kind of showcases some of the changes in Europe that happens. Obviously, we find the New World, we find new religions, and then there's a whole bunch of conflicts, and we kind of figure out a way to overcome those and to hopefully make a little bit of money. And so we'll talk about that as we move forward. You have some assignments and a test over these first 3 chapters. And so I wish you luck on that. And we will see you with chapter 8 in a little bit. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.